Hey guys, tonight we are diving into something that makes the opioid crisis look like a mild misunderstanding at a pharmacy counter. The golden age of American medicine, when your neighborhood doctor could legally keep your entire cul-de-sac chemically sedated, and nobody, not your husband, not your mother-in-law, not the PTA, thought that was even slightly unusual. We're talking about the 1960s, a decade that gave us the moon landing, the miniskirt, and the quiet pharmaceutical miracle of keeping suburban housewives, anxious executives, and mildly inconvenient teenagers so deeply tranquilized that whole neighborhoods function like a very pleasant, slightly glazed diorama of the American dream. Before you get comfortable, and you are going to get very comfortable tonight, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a truly enormous thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and I want you to know that your suggestion arrived at 2 a.m. with a long personal note that I read 3 times, and I appreciated every word of it. Your suggestions genuinely shape this channel. Speaking of which, we're now on Spotify, so if you prefer to let history wash over you while you do other things, the link is in the description. Leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Somehow it is always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that deeply comforting. Now dim those lights, put on a fan, pull the blanket up to your chin, maybe pour yourself something warm, and please, I am begging you, do not take anything a doctor prescribed you before 1972 without asking some follow-up questions first. Let's pause here. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live in one of those gleaming 1960s suburbs, where the lawns were perfect and the smiles were a little too steady? Have you ever wondered why Grandma seemed so unruffled by absolutely everything? Why did the neighborhood seem so quiet on weekday afternoons? Why did your mother's doctor appointments last exactly 4 minutes, and she always came home with a small brown bottle? What exactly was in those bottles? Was everyone on something? Could you get a prescription for being a woman? Could you get a prescription for being a husband who was annoying his wife? Could a doctor look at an entire zip code and decide it needed medicating? The answer, as it turns out, is yes. Emphatically, enthusiastically, and with a very nice leather bag full of samples, yes. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1962. Your lawn is immaculate. Your refrigerator is humming. Your doctor is on his way over and he has brought his prescription pad. The suburb had a name, a zip code, and by the early 1960s, a pharmacist who recognized every face that walked through his door. This wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that roughly 1 in 4 of those faces belonged to someone picking up Milltown, Valium, or a newer tranquilizer with a friendly brand name and a pastel-coloured pill, prescribed not for a specific crisis but for the general experience of being alive in post-war America. The suburb didn't know it was medicated, it thought it was doing well, and by the metrics available to it, it was. The lawns were maintained, the cars were washed, the children arrived at school on time, hair combed, lunches packed. The neighborhood association met monthly and resolved disputes about fence heights with a civility that, in retrospect, suggests either genuine community spirit or a population too chemically smoothed to sustain an argument past the second agenda item. Probably some of both. You live on a street like this. Your house is the 3rd one on the left, the one with the aluminum screen door that squeaks when you push it. You have a neighbour named Carol who always seems remarkably calm for a woman with 4 children under the age of 8. You've assumed this is a personality trait. It is not entirely a personality trait. Here is what you don't know yet. The pharmacist on Main Street fills more prescriptions per capita than any comparable town in the county. The doctor whose office sits above the hardware store has one of the highest prescribing rates in the state. Neither of these facts is public information. There is no scoreboard. There is no announcement. There is simply the quiet, efficient machinery of a medical culture that has decided the appropriate response to the stresses of modern suburban life is a small pill taken once or twice daily with water. Think about what that means for a moment. An entire community, going about its business, mowing its grass, attending its church socials, driving its children to piano lessons, and somewhere beneath the surface of all that ordinary motion, a pharmaceutical current running through it like a second water table. You can't see it, you can't taste it, but it is there, keeping the temperature down, keeping the edges soft, keeping the whole elaborate performance of contentment just slightly more performable than it would otherwise be. This is not a scandal, exactly. Not yet. In 1962, it does not feel like a scandal to anyone involved. It feels like medicine doing its job. The patients feel better, the doctors feel useful, the pharmaceutical companies feel profitable, the neighbours feel calm. It's the kind of arrangement that works very smoothly until the moment you start asking what, precisely, it is working instead of. The suburb has a name, it has a zip code, it has a school, 3 churches, a volunteer fire department, and a pharmacy where the man behind the counter knows your name and your prescription, and the date your refill is due, and where he greets you with the easy warmth of someone whose livelihood depends on your returning, which it does, which you will, which in the 1960s is simply called healthcare. Later, much later, someone will look back at this town, at all the towns like this one, which is to say most of the towns, and ask who decided this was a good idea. The answer, when it comes, will be complicated, distributed, and deeply unsatisfying. Nobody decided, everybody decided. The town got a prescription the way towns get most things, gradually, collectively, and without anyone in particular signing off on it. To understand why 1960s doctors handed out tranquilizers the way Halloween candy was distributed to children, cheerfully, abundantly, and without much thought about consequences, you need to understand the decade that came before. The 1950s built the suburb, the ranch house, the station wagon, and the role of the American housewife with the same industrial efficiency that built the highways connecting them all. Everything had a place, everyone had a function, and a remarkable number of people were quietly, decorously, deeply unhappy about it. You're not supposed to be unhappy. This is important. Unhappiness in the post-war American suburb is not merely an emotional state. It is a kind of social failure, a suggestion that something has gone wrong with the arrangement that everyone around you appears to find perfectly satisfactory. The men came home from the war. The factories converted back to consumer goods. The government offered loans for houses in new developments, where the streets were freshly paved, and the neighbours were strangers, and the whole thing had the quality of a stage set erected overnight on what had recently been a field. And you were supposed to be grateful. You had reason to be grateful. The depression was over. The war was over. There was food in the refrigerator and a television in the living room, and a paediatrician who made house calls. If you woke up at 3 a.m. with the particular hollow feeling of someone who cannot explain what is wrong, the approved response was to push that feeling down somewhere it could not be easily located and go back to sleep. The 50s perfected this suppression. It was not hypocrisy exactly. Most people genuinely wanted the security they had. But security and fulfillment are different things, and the post-war decade did not distinguish between them. You had the house, therefore you had the life. What else could there be? The question was not asked in polite company, which meant it was asked constantly, in private, in the kitchen, in the car, at 3 a.m, by people who had no framework for asking it, and no one to ask it to. By the time the 1960s arrived, that accumulated, unexpressed question had been sitting in the American nervous system for 15 years. An entire generation of adults had been performing contentment with the disciplined consistency of people who have been told in every available cultural language that contentment is what they should be feeling. The body keeps a record of this kind of thing. It doesn't file the record anywhere convenient. It files it in the shoulders, the sleep, the jaw, the persistent low-grade sense that something is simply too much, or not enough, or both simultaneously. Doctors recognized these symptoms. They had been seeing them steadily since the early 50s, and they named them anxiety, nervous exhaustion, tension. They did not yet have Valium. They had barbiturates, which worked but carried a serious risk of overdose. They had therapy, which took years and cost money and carried a stigma most patients found prohibitive. What they needed, what the market, attentive as always, recognized they needed, was something clean, simple, and daily. Something you could take with breakfast. Something that would not fix the world but would make the world slightly more manageable, which in the 50s and early 60s was as much as most people thought to ask for. The pill was coming. The world had been building it a room for years. The year is 1955, and a pharmaceutical company has just released a small white tablet called Milltown, and America has never been the same since. Named, with magnificent indifference to poetry, after the New Jersey town where the laboratory was located, Milltown was the first blockbuster tranquilizer in American history. Within a year of its release, roughly 1 in 20 Americans had tried it. Celebrities mentioned it by name on television. Doctors prescribed it for everything from anxiety to insomnia, to what one physician described simply as the feeling that modern life is too much, which was, at that moment in history, essentially everyone. You take the first one on a Tuesday. Your doctor prescribed it on a Friday, explained that it would take the edge off, and used the phrase "nothing to worry about," in a tone that suggested worrying about it would itself be a sign that you needed it. The pharmacist put it in a brown glass bottle with a white label. You kept it in the medicine cabinet for 4 days, looking at it with the cautious interest of someone who's been told the stove is not hot and is not entirely sure they believe it. Tuesday arrives. You take it with a glass of water. Within 40 minutes something happens, not dramatic. Not anything you could point to specifically, but a quality in the air, a particular way the afternoon seems less urgent than it did before. The dishes are still in the sink. The children are still loud. The husband is still coming home at 6 with the same expression he's been wearing since March. None of this has changed, but you're standing slightly further away from all of it, looking at it through something that is not quite glass but functions similarly. This is the Milltown experience, and in 1955, America finds it extraordinary. Not because it is strange, but because it is so profoundly, immediately familiar. People had been trying to achieve this particular relationship with their own anxiety for years, through alcohol, through sheer force of will, through the Methodist Church, through the aggressive pursuit of hobbies. Here was a pill that did it cleanly, predictably, in under an hour, without the headache or the social complications. Milltown was technically a muscle relaxant with sedative properties, a meprobamate compound discovered more or less accidentally by a Czechoslovakian chemist named Frank Berger, who noticed that it calmed laboratory animals without knocking them unconscious. This struck him as interesting. He was right. The distinction mattered enormously. Previous sedatives flattened you. Milltown merely sanded you down. You could take it and still function. You could take it and still seem, from the outside, entirely yourself. You were yourself, just yourself with slightly less friction. By 1960, 36 million prescriptions had been written. There were Milltown jokes on late-night radio. There was a cocktail called the Miltini. There was, briefly, a shortage, actual pharmacy shortages, in major American cities, because demand had so thoroughly outpaced supply that the manufacturer was asking doctors to please slow down a little. The doctors did not noticeably slow down. What Milltown created was not merely a market. It created a concept. The idea that anxiety was a medical condition rather than a feature of human experience. That the appropriate response to the ordinary terror of being alive in the modern world was a pharmaceutical one. And that this was progress, not avoidance. It was a concept that would outlive Milltown itself by several decades. The pill is long gone. The concept is still very much with us. In the 1960s, your doctor still came to you. He drove a sensible American car, carried a leather bag, and arrived at the front door with the authority of someone who had gone to medical school in the 40s and had not been seriously questioned since. He was not a specialist. He was your doctor, which meant he treated your strep throat, your bad back, your mother's arthritis, and whatever you called nerves. A word that covered a remarkable amount of ground in that era, and required almost no additional explanation. He parks at the curb on a Thursday afternoon. You have called ahead, as you were told to. You open the call by saying you weren't feeling like yourself, which was the accepted opening, and he said he'd stop by around 3, which he did because in 1962 3 o'clock still meant 3 o'clock, and the doctor still came to the house, and the system worked with a reliability that would not survive the decade. He sits in the kitchen. You offer him coffee, he accepts. There is a competent, slightly formal warmth to the interaction. He has known you for 9 years, delivered your second child, treated your husband's knee, and prescribed your mother-in-law's heart medication. He is not a stranger. He is in some ways more present in your life than your own relatives. He knows things about your body that your closest friends don't know. He knows what your blood pressure does in winter. He asks how you're sleeping. You say not well. He asks how long. You say a few months. He asks if there's anything specific worrying you. You pause. Everything is worrying you and nothing is worrying you, in the particular way that something structural becomes invisible when you've been inside it long enough. You say the children, the house, just feeling stretched thin. He nods. He has heard this in 7 other kitchens this week. He reaches into the leather bag. He explains that there is something new, very well tolerated, very effective, nothing habit-forming. The company has done extensive studies. He writes the prescription in a handwriting that is technically legible and emotionally authoritative. He tears it from the pad. He hands it to you across the kitchen table as though he is handing you a solution, which, from his perspective in 1963, he genuinely is. The house call will not survive the decade. Insurance reimbursement structures will make it impractical. The pace of medicine will accelerate past the pace of a sensible car at 3 in the afternoon. The doctor will eventually become someone you see in a waiting room, briefly, with a copay. But the prescription, that particular gesture, that confidence, that reaching into the bag, that will survive. It will outlive the leather bags and the house calls and the coffee in the kitchen and the particular doctor sitting across from you right now, who means well, who has always meant well, who is writing your name at the top of the pad in the confident belief that he is helping. He finishes his coffee. He stands up. He reminds you to call if it's not working within 2 weeks. He drives to the next house on his list, where there is another kitchen, another woman who isn't sleeping well, another cup of coffee, another prescription torn carefully from the pad. By 5 o'clock he has helped 6 people. He is satisfied. He is, in the language available to 1963, a very good doctor. Before there was a diagnosis, there was a word: nerves. It was used by women more than men, by doctors more than patients, and by society as a whole to describe the very specific experience of being a person whose inner life did not match the cheerful surface of the world around them. Nerves was not depression. Nerves was not anxiety disorder. Nerves was not burnout, dissociation, or existential dread, though it was often all of those things simultaneously. Nerves was simply what happened when a human being was expected to perform contentment for too many years in a row, and something in the performance started to slip. You know what your nerves feel like. You've been acquainted with them since approximately the 3rd year of your marriage, when the initial effort of setting up a life gave way to the longer, quieter effort of maintaining one. It's not pain exactly. It's more like a persistent hum in the background of everything, a frequency just above the threshold of consciousness that doesn't prevent you from doing anything, but makes everything slightly harder than it should reasonably be. In the morning it arrives before you're fully awake, the day already loaded and heavy before you've sat up. In the afternoon it collects in your shoulders. In the evening, when the house is finally quiet and you might theoretically relax, it becomes most insistent, as if it has been waiting all day for you to have a moment and now intends to use it. You are not sick. Nothing is specifically wrong. You're simply living at a register that the body was not entirely designed to sustain indefinitely. Doctors in the 1960s were not wrong to recognize this. Where they went sideways was in what they did with the recognition. Nerves became a shorthand that closed a conversation rather than opened one. It said, "I see that you are struggling, and the struggle has a name, and the name is a category, and the category has a treatment, and here is the treatment. Goodbye." It took something complex and human, and if you were willing to look at it carefully, quite informative, and it processed it into a condition. Conditions have prescriptions. Prescriptions end appointments. The word itself is worth sitting with. Nerves. It is almost affectionate the way people used it. She has her nerves, a neighbour might say, not unkindly. It suggests fragility without implying dysfunction, something delicate rather than broken, something that requires management rather than repair. It also, usefully, does not require the speaker or the patient or the doctor to say anything more specific. It does not require asking why. It does not require any investigation into the life that produced it. It simply names the symptom and moves on. What nerves actually was, in most cases, was a life that had been designed for a person without consulting the person. A schedule, a role, a set of daily obligations that were perfectly reasonable on paper and quietly maddening in practice. A social world organised around the maintenance of appearances rather than the expression of actual experience. A marriage that was, more often than not, two people living parallel lives in the same house, one of whom had been culturally trained to call this love. The diagnosis was real. The treatment was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of ineffective, the pills worked, in the short term, quite well. Wrong in the sense that they answered a question nobody had asked. The question was, what is this feeling? The answer, which nobody gave, was information. The answer that got given instead came in a small brown bottle, twice daily with water, refillable for up to a year. It was a very clean solution to a question that deserved a much more complicated answer. By the late 1950s, the pharmaceutical companies had discovered something extraordinary. The American suburb was not merely a place where people lived. It was a market, a captive, anxious, house-proud, over-caffeinated market full of people who wanted to feel better and had doctors willing to help them feel better in ways that came in a bottle. The salesmen, and they were called detail men, arrived in clean suits with briefcases full of samples, and they called on physicians the way insurance agents called on homeowners, warmly, frequently, and with literature. The detail man who calls on your doctor is named something like Bob. He has a good haircut and a firm handshake, and a briefcase that opens to reveal, with the satisfying efficiency of a well-organised drawer, a row of sample boxes, a laminated datasheet summarising clinical trial results, and a notepad with the company logo embossed on the cover. He has driven 40 minutes to this appointment. He will drive 40 minutes to the next one. He will do this 5 days a week, calling on a circuit of 15 to 20 physicians, and at the end of the quarter he will be evaluated on how many prescriptions those physicians wrote. He does not tell the doctor what to prescribe. He's very clear about this, both to the doctor and to himself. What he does is make the medication visible. He makes it present, familiar, associated with his pleasant face and good haircut, and the free lunch he occasionally provides. He leaves behind samples. Samples are important. A doctor with samples has a ready response to a patient who says they can't afford to try something. "New here," he says, handing over a week's supply. "See how this feels." The patient takes the sample. The patient returns in 2 weeks and says it helped. The doctor reaches for his pad. This is not corruption. This is important to understand. By the legal and ethical standards of the 1960s, this is simply commerce, the ordinary mechanism by which new treatments reach the people who need them. The pharmaceutical companies genuinely believed their products helped. The detail men genuinely believed they were facilitating healthcare. The doctors genuinely believed the clinical data in the laminated sheets. Everyone in the chain was, within their own understanding, doing their job. What nobody in the chain was doing was asking whether the aggregate effect of all those individual, well-intentioned decisions was a good idea, whether the suburb needed medicating, whether the anxiety that was being so efficiently treated was perhaps better understood as a signal than a symptom, whether the detail man's briefcase, however elegantly organized, contained a solution to a problem that had been incompletely diagnosed. The industry did what industries do. It met demand. But it also shaped demand, in the quiet ways that advertising shapes demand, not by inventing a need, but by identifying an existing one, and naming it in terms that made a product the obvious answer. You have nerves. We have Milltown. You have modern life. We have Valium. You have an appointment in 6 minutes. We have a sample pack right here. The logic was seamless, the progression was natural, and by the time the suburb had its prescription, nobody could quite identify the moment the decision had been made because it hadn't been a decision. It had been a series of reasonable steps, each one sensible, each one well-intentioned, each one advancing the process without anyone pausing at the top of the staircase to ask where exactly the stairs led. 1963 is the year a Swiss chemist named Leo Sternbach finalized the compound that would become Valium, and the world would never be the same, or rather the world would stay exactly the same, but a great many people inside it would feel considerably less bothered by that fact. Valium was smoother than Milltown, more targeted than the older barbiturates, and marketed with the kind of friendly, almost avuncular confidence that suggested taking it was not a sign of weakness, but of good sense. Within a decade it would become the most prescribed drug in the Western world, and the phrase "mother's little helper" would make its way into a Rolling Stones song because art has always been good at noticing what medicine prefers not to discuss. The chemistry is worth a moment. Valium, diazepam, works by enhancing the effect of a neurotransmitter called GABA, which is the brain's primary inhibitory signal, its internal quiet voice, its way of telling itself, this is not an emergency. Anxiety at the neurological level is the brain deciding too many things are emergencies. Valium turns down the volume on that assessment. It does not change anything in your life. It does not fix the dishes or the marriage or the children or the particular emptiness of a Tuesday afternoon in a 3-bedroom house in a suburb where every house looks like yours. It simply makes all of that feel less urgent, which in 1963 turns out to be exactly what the market wants. The drug is approved by the FDA in 1963. By 1968, it is the most prescribed drug in the United States. By 1978, it will have held that title for 6 consecutive years. There are years in the 1970s when American doctors write more than 2 billion individual Valium tablets worth of prescriptions annually. 2 billion. That is a number that requires a moment. Not millions. Billions. Enough tablets distributed evenly for every adult in the country to have several. You get your first prescription in the spring of 1964. Your doctor describes it as an improvement on what you've been taking, cleaner, better tolerated, more refined. He says refined the way a sommelier says refined, with the implication that you're now drinking something better and that your taste has been honoured by the upgrade. You take the first one at 7 in the morning. By 8 you're driving the children to school, and the road looks fine, the day looks fine, the whole project of the morning looks entirely manageable, which it was before technically, but which now feels manageable in a way that you can inhabit rather than merely observe. This is the thing about Valium that made it unprecedented. It did not sedate you, exactly. It let you function. You could take it and still be present for the day, still make the lunches, still attend the school play, still have the conversation at the dinner table. You were simply doing all of those things from a slightly greater emotional distance. Professionally, socially, domestically, you were right there. Internally, you were approximately 1.5 floors up, watching through a window, calm. The Rolling Stones noticed in 1966. The song is a 3-minute portrait of a woman who needs her pills to get through the day, and a doctor who provides them, and a culture that has organised itself around the pretense that this is treatment. The song is not angry exactly. It is sardonic, which is worse. It noticed something real and held it up for examination, and then the radio played it between advertisements for the same products it was criticising, because that is also something that culture does, and then everyone went about their day. Valium is still prescribed. The era it defined is over. The molecule remains. The average patient interaction in a 1960s general practice lasted approximately 6 minutes, which, when you consider that diagnosis, examination, treatment plan and prescription were all expected to happen within that window, gives you some sense of the pace at which decisions were being made. You sat down. You said you weren't sleeping well. You said the children were a lot. You said you'd been feeling. And here you searched for the right word. Tense. The doctor nodded. He had heard this before. He was hearing it constantly, from every woman in the waiting room, from the man who came in about his back and mentioned while leaving that he'd been having trouble at the office. He reached for his pad. The waiting room, before you got to the 6 minutes, was its own environment. You have been sitting here for 20 minutes reading a copy of Life magazine from 3 months ago, and you are aware, with a particular social awareness of someone who has spent a decade calibrating herself against the comfort of others, that you're not the only person in this room who looks a certain way. There is a woman across from you who is holding her purse very tightly. There is a man near the window who is staring at the floor with the concentration of someone trying not to think. There is an older woman in a blue coat who has been called in once already and sent back out with instructions to wait, and whose expression has not changed at any point. Nobody speaks. The waiting room is understood to be a space for waiting, not for community, not for the recognition of shared experience, not for the useful information that could pass between people who are all, in their various ways, here for the same reason. You sit, you wait. You are called. 6 minutes has a shape. It begins with the doctor asking what brings you in, and you have prepared a version of the answer that is clear and brief, and presents the problem as medical rather than existential, because you have intuited correctly that existential is not a category this interaction has time for. You have a symptom. The symptom has a name. The name leads to a treatment. That is the structure of a successful appointment, and you have internalized it the way you've internalized most things in your life, efficiently, without being asked to, in the service of keeping something running smoothly. What you're not asked: how long has this been building, and what was happening in your life when it started? Whether the sleeplessness is about anxiety or about something more specific that the anxiety is covering. Whether your marriage is as calm as it appears from the outside, or whether it is performing calmness the way the neighbourhood performs calmness, with considerable effort and a certain pharmaceutical assistance. Whether you want to feel better, or whether you want your life to be different, and whether you understand yet that those are not the same request. None of these questions are asked, not because the doctor is cruel or indifferent. He is not. He is a person who went into medicine because he wanted to help people, but because the system he operates within has not given him the tools, the time, or the cultural framework to ask them. He has 6 minutes. He has a waiting room full of people with 6 minutes each. He has a briefcase full of samples and a genuine belief that they will help. The appointment ends. You have a prescription. You did not get what you came for, which was to be understood. You got the next best thing, which was to be treated. In 1962, this passes for the same thing. You thank him and stand up and put your coat on and go back out through the waiting room, and the woman with the purse watches you leave, and the man by the window does not look up, and the door closes, and the next name is called. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up in a blood test. It doesn't register as a fever or a broken bone or anything that a stethoscope can find. It is the exhaustion of performing a life rather than living one, of maintaining the kitchen, the children, the social calendar, and the husband's comfort with a steadiness that, viewed from the outside, looks a great deal like contentment. 1960s suburban housewives were performing this particular kind of exhaustion at an extraordinary scale. And the medical system, to its credit, noticed. To its lasting discredit, it reached for a prescription rather than a question. Your day begins before anyone else is awake. You've set the alarm 20 minutes early to do this, to have 20 minutes that are yours before the morning becomes a series of other people's requirements. You stand in the kitchen with the coffee, which is the first cup and is therefore still good, and you look at the backyard, which is wet with dew and entirely still, and you experience something close to peace, which you know from experience will last approximately until 6:45. At 6:45, the house begins. Breakfast, lunches, school clothes, the permission slip that was supposed to go in last Wednesday, and was found this morning in a coat pocket, the argument about shoes, the husband who cannot find his keys, the youngest one who will not eat the eggs. By 7:50 it is done. The car has left. The house is yours again, except that it is never really yours, because the house is also the job, the dishes, the laundry, the grocery list, the school pick-up at 3, the dinner that needs to be started by 4 to be ready by 6. The social infrastructure of a neighbourhood and a family and a marriage that you maintain with the invisible skill of someone who has been so good at it for so long that nobody has thought to notice it is skill. This was the life that the post-war suburb built and populated. It was, in material terms, a very good life. It had refrigeration and running water and children who were fed and safe and growing. It was better by every measurable standard than what had come before. The women who lived it knew this, and they believed it, and they also, in the particular privacy of their own inner lives, felt the specific weight of a world that had given them security and comfort, and almost nothing to think about that was genuinely theirs. Betty Friedan would call this the problem that has no name, in a book she published in 1963 that a remarkable number of suburban housewives read and recognised and then put carefully away where their husbands wouldn't see it. The problem had a name now. That helped. What it did not have in 1963 was a practical solution that fit within the existing structure of a life that was already fully constructed and not easily rebuilt. The pills fit. That is the blunt and slightly terrible truth of it. The pills fit inside a life that could not easily be changed. They did not require a revolution. They did not require a conversation, a divorce, a degree, a renegotiation of every arrangement that had been made over the past decade. They required a 6-minute appointment and a pharmacy and a glass of water at 8 in the morning. They let you continue. They made the continuing manageable. This is not a story about stupid women or malicious doctors or cartoonishly evil pharmaceutical companies. It is a story about a system that offered a small, convenient solution to a large, inconvenient problem, and a population that accepted the small solution because the large problem did not yet have a language, let alone a door-marked exit. If you want to understand how an entire generation of doctors came to think of tranquilizers as a first-line response to the ordinary pressures of domestic life, you might start with the advertisements in their professional journals. These were not subtle. A 1960s ad for Valium shows a woman, middle-aged, well-dressed, standing in her kitchen with the headline, "For the anxiety that comes from not fitting in." Another shows a woman who appears to be in her late 30s staring at a pile of dishes, with copy that reads, "She can't go on feeling this way." The ads did not say sedate her. They said help her. The distinction was politely blurred. You are a doctor. You are reading the Journal of the American Medical Association on a Thursday evening, which is when you read it because Thursday evening is when the week has slowed enough to permit reading. You have the journal open on the desk. You have a glass of something beside it. The lamp is on. The advertisements are between the research articles, printed on glossy paper in full colour, a production quality that outstrips the editorial content in the way that advertising always outstrips the thing it is advertising for. The ad you're looking at now shows a woman. She's probably 40. She is neatly dressed in the manner of someone who has made a considerable effort to look effortless. She is standing in what appears to be a very clean living room, and her expression is one that you, as a physician, recognize immediately. It is the expression of someone who is holding things together and would like, urgently, to stop holding things together, just for a moment, just long enough to breathe. The headline says, "When the pressures of modern living become too great." The body copy lists the symptoms: tension, insomnia, irritability, difficulty concentrating, and then it names the product, and it lists the dosage, and it says, with the confident simplicity of something that doesn't need to try very hard, helps her cope. This is the rhetorical work the ad is doing, and it is doing it on you, the doctor, with considerable sophistication. It is not telling you to prescribe mindlessly. It is showing you a patient you recognize, because you have seen her in your waiting room every week for years, and it is associating your recognition of her distress with a specific clinical response. You know how to treat an infection. You know how to treat a fracture. Now you know how to treat this. The woman in the clean living room who is holding things together too hard. You prescribe. That is what doctors do. The ads also performed a second, quieter function. They normalized the patient type. By showing the same woman, the anxious housewife, the stressed executive, the aging gentleman who finds retirement more difficult than expected, again and again across years of issues, they were effectively defining a patient population. They were saying, this is a medical condition. These are medical patients. They need medical treatment. The pills were the treatment. The definition was constructed precisely to fit the pills. None of this was illegal. None of it was even, by the standards of its era, particularly controversial. Medical journals had carried pharmaceutical advertising for decades. Doctors had always received information about new medications through industry channels. The system had never been designed around the assumption that the information might be shaped by the interest of the people providing it, because medicine, in 1962, still understood itself as a guild operating above commercial logic. It was not operating above commercial logic. It was operating deeply within it, in the way that a person who has always lived inside a building may not notice the walls. The ads were the walls. The doctor read the journal. On Thursday evening, in the lamplight, he turned the glossy page and looked at the woman in the clean living room, and he understood exactly who she was because she was sitting in his waiting room right now, and he knew how to help her. It would be a mistake to think tranquilizers were exclusively a women's issue in the 1960s, though the marketing certainly leaned in that direction. Men were prescribed them too for what their doctors called executive stress, occupational anxiety, or the particular pressures of being responsible for a household, a career, and the general project of post-war prosperity. The language was different. Where a woman's prescription acknowledged nerves, a man's prescription addressed performance. The pill was often the same. The story told about it was carefully, deliberately different. You're a man in 1964, and you have a job title, a mortgage, a wife, 2 children, a car that needs new tyres, and a manager who has been making comments in the weekly meeting that you have been turning over in your mind every night since Tuesday. You do not have nerves, you have pressure. This is an important distinction in the vocabulary of post-war American masculinity. Nerves is something that happens to women, to the delicate and the overwrought. Pressure is something that happens to men who are succeeding, a byproduct of importance, a side effect of being load-bearing. You are load-bearing. The pressure is evidence of this. Your doctor, who has known you since your physical 5 years ago, calls it executive stress when he writes it in your chart. He does not call it anxiety. He may not even say the word aloud. He says you've been running hard, which is true, and that the body sometimes needs a little help keeping pace with the demands you're placing on it, which is also framed as a compliment. He writes a prescription for a low dose of Librium, chlordiazepoxide, Valium's older cousin, released in 1960 and marketed, not coincidentally, with a particular emphasis on male professional patients. The Librium ads in medical journals from the early 1960s are worth examining separately from the Valium ones. Where the Valium advertisements showed women in domestic settings, the Librium ads showed men in offices, men at desks, men in suits with their heads in their hands, but tastefully, with the kind of contained despair appropriate to someone managing a lot of responsibilities rather than simply falling apart. The headline on one famous ad reads, "For the anxiety of everyday living." The man in the illustration is clearly a professional. He is clearly important. He is clearly, briefly, struggling. The message is, this is not weakness. This is the cost of being the kind of man who matters. Here is something that helps men like you continue to be men like you. This framing did something important. It sold the same sedation as an enhancement rather than a remedy. The housewife's Valium was for her nerves, which implied something had gone wrong. The executive's Librium was for his performance, which implied something was being optimized. The net neurological effect was functionally identical. The story attached to it pointed in opposite directions, which tells you considerably more about 1960s gender ideology than it does about pharmacology. What the men's prescriptions also reveal is the particular anxiety of post-war American masculinity itself. The breadwinner model that the suburb was built around placed an enormous and largely unacknowledged weight on the men inside it. The expectation was total. You provided, you protected, you did not discuss the cost of providing and protecting in any emotional register that might be mistaken for weakness. You did not say you were afraid, you said you were under pressure. You did not go to therapy. Therapy was for people who had cracked, and cracking was not on the schedule. You took the pill that the doctor gave you, which was framed as the sensible, practical, competent response of a man who manages his resources effectively. Nobody called it sedation. They called it support. The man in the suit drove home at 6, kissed his wife, sat down to dinner, and felt the evening arrive with slightly less friction than it would have otherwise. He was present. He was functional. He was by every available measure fine. The pill remained in his briefcase, next to his date book, unremarkable, professional, necessary, a tool, not a symptom. There was a man, and it was almost always a man, who stood between the prescription pad and the patient's kitchen cabinet, and that man was the pharmacist. In the 1960s, the pharmacist knew things. He knew which families were going through a hard stretch. He knew which doctors prescribed heavily and which prescribed rarely. He knew that the woman who came in every 3 weeks for her refill had been coming in every 3 weeks for 2 years, and he knew the woman before her had been doing the same thing for 5. He filled the prescriptions. His job was not to question them. His name is something like Harold, and he's been behind this counter since 1951, when he bought the pharmacy from the man who built it in 1933, and the neighbourhood has changed around him in the way that suburbs change, growing outward, filling in, new houses on what were recently fields, new faces that become regular faces that become names that become, eventually, the names on the prescription labels he prints with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this so many times that the motion is below the level of thought. He knows your name before you reach the counter. He knows what you're picking up. He sometimes has it ready, because your refill schedule is consistent, and he has learned to anticipate it the way he anticipates the Tuesday delivery or the Thursday afternoon rush of people stopping in after school pickup. He hands it across the counter in a white paper bag, stapled at the top with the information sheet folded inside. He says, "Take care." He means it. What Harold knows, and what sits in the back of his professional mind in the way that things sit when you're not quite ready to examine them directly, is that some of the people he's serving have been on these medications for a very long time. There are women in this neighbourhood whose relationship with the brown bottle is older than their children's memories. There are men who have been picking up their prescription quietly, at off-peak hours, for years. There are older patients whose doctors have been refilling the same order so automatically that Harold suspects nobody has actually reviewed the medication in quite some time. He has the training to know that benzodiazepines are not meant for indefinite use. The manufacturer's own literature, which he has read, recommends short-term prescribing. The gap between that recommendation and what he observes moving across his counter every week is considerable. He is aware of the gap. He is not, under the professional and legal framework of 1965, empowered to close it. The pharmacist's role in the 1960s is dispensing, not counselling. He fills the prescription the doctor wrote. He checks for dangerous interactions, of which there are sometimes more than the prescribing physician realised. He provides the information sheet. He's available for questions, and sometimes people ask them, and he answers carefully, staying within the bounds of what the doctor has authorised. He does not call the doctor and say, "Mrs. Henderson has been refilling this every 22 days for 31 months, and I think we should talk about that." That conversation does not have an established protocol. That conversation, in 1965, has not really been invited. So Harold hands the bag across the counter, and he says, "Take care," and he watches the door close, and he turns to the next prescription in the queue. He is a good pharmacist. He is doing his job well within the definition of his job that the system has provided. The definition will not be significantly revised for another decade. In the meantime, the bags go across the counter, the refills come in, the records are kept in meticulous order, and Harold goes home on Thursday evenings and does not think about it more than is comfortable. Because thinking about it more than is comfortable is not going to change what happens on Friday morning when the queue begins again. The tranquilizer era was not, despite the mythology, exclusively a middle-aged adult problem. Children with behavioural issues, a category so broad in 1960s paediatrics that it could encompass anything from genuine hyperactivity to the ordinary frustration of a bored 10-year-old in a school that wasn't working for them, were being medicated with increasing frequency. Teenagers were prescribed sedatives for anxiety. Young women heading to college were sometimes sent with a small bottle of something to help with the transition. The logic was the same. Discomfort was a problem medicine could solve, and medicine was right there, ready. Your son is 9 years old and he cannot sit still. This is the presenting complaint, the phrase the teacher used in the note she sent home, the phrase you used when you repeated it to the pediatrician, the phrase that now sits in a chart with his name on it. He cannot sit still. He talks when he's not supposed to talk. He finishes his work quickly and then becomes a problem while the other children catch up. He is, by any objective measure, a healthy, energetic child operating in an environment that was not particularly well designed for healthy, energetic children. The 1960s classroom was built for compliance. Rows of desks, a teacher at the front, a curriculum that moved at the pace of the median student, and a behavioural expectation of sustained stillness that would have presented a challenge to most adults sitting in the same chairs for 6 hours. The children who met this expectation easily, who could be still, who could be quiet, who could direct their attention for extended periods in a room with 30 other children, who were also supposed to be directing their attention, were described as good students. The children who could not were described as problems, and the problems were increasingly being referred to the pediatrician. The pediatrician, in 1963, had options. He could suggest the parents were too permissive. He could suggest the school was too rigid. Both of these involved telling people things they did not want to hear, and neither produced a quick resolution. Or he could prescribe something, not Valium, typically, for a 9-year-old, but something adjacent. Meprobemmaris for the very anxious child. A mild sedative for the child who wasn't sleeping. By the middle of the decade, Ritalin, a stimulant, not a tranquilizer, but part of the same impulse, was becoming available for children described as hyperactive, and the category of hyperactive was expanding with a speed that suggested it was being shaped by the availability of the treatment as much as by the incidence of the condition. Teenagers occupied a different and more complicated position. They were old enough to have their own feelings about being medicated, and young enough that those feelings were not generally consulted. A 17-year-old girl who was having panic attacks before school could be prescribed a benzodiazepine with the same casual authority as her mother, and the prescription was filled into her mother's care, and the mother dispensed it in the morning, and the girl went to school and felt the panic arrive, and felt it arrive muffled, at a distance, which was an improvement over the alternative but was also not, in any meaningful sense, treatment. The young women heading to college are worth a particular pause. The transition to college in the early 1960s was understood to be stressful, and stress had by this point been established as a medical category requiring intervention. Some family doctors sent their female patients off with a prescription as a matter of routine, something to have on hand just in case. The case inevitably arose on the first difficult week. The prescription was filled. The bottle appeared in the dormitory bathroom. The roommate asked what it was. The answer established a pattern that would follow some of these women for years. The edges of the experiment were not edges anyone had drawn deliberately. They were the natural perimeter of a logic applied consistently. If anxiety is a medical condition, and medicine treats medical conditions, then anxious children and anxious teenagers and anxious young women are medical patients. The prescription followed from the premise as surely as the math. Nobody had checked whether the premise was right. One of the quieter tensions running beneath the tranquilizer era was a professional one. Who, exactly, was qualified to prescribe medications for mental and emotional distress? Psychiatrists had the training. General practitioners had the patients. And in the 1960s, when psychiatry was still fighting for credibility, and most Americans would no sooner see a psychiatrist than admit publicly to owning problems, the GP won by default. He was the one people trusted. He was the one they'd been seeing for 20 years, and he was increasingly the one handing out pills for conditions he had trained for precisely as long as the appointments took. The psychiatrist in your suburb has an office on the second floor of a brick building 3 miles from the centre of town. His name is on a small brass plate by the door. He has a very good waiting room with leather chairs and a plant and a pile of magazines that are slightly more highbrow than the magazines in a general practitioner's waiting room, which is itself a kind of statement. He has seen perhaps 40 patients this year. He has a long waiting list. He charges significantly more than the GP per appointment. His appointments last 50 minutes. Most people in your suburb will never see him. Not because they don't have problems that fall within his expertise, they clearly do in considerable numbers, but because seeing a psychiatrist in 1963 means in the social register of the suburb that you have a problem. Not the ordinary, manageable problems that everyone has and that the GP handles with efficiency and discretion. A problem. The kind that requires the brass plate and the 50-minute appointment and the careful business of not being seen going in or coming out. This is not rational. It is, however, deeply human, and the pharmaceutical companies understood it before most psychiatrists did. The tranquilizer was, among other things, a way of receiving psychiatric treatment without the stigma of psychiatric treatment. You were not seeing a psychiatrist. You were seeing your doctor, the same man who treated your strep throat and your mother's hip, and he was giving you something for your nerves, which was a perfectly ordinary thing that plenty of people were doing, nothing to remark upon, nothing to hide. The psychiatrists, for their part, had complicated feelings about this arrangement. On one hand, it was reaching patients who would never have reached them, millions of anxious Americans receiving some form of treatment for conditions that psychiatry recognized and cared about. On the other hand, the treatment being provided bore only a passing resemblance to psychiatry. A prescription for Valium from a GP who spent 6 minutes with a patient he had known for 9 years was not the same as a therapeutic relationship with a trained specialist. It treated the symptom. It did not treat the person. The disagreement was largely internal to medicine and therefore invisible to patients. What was visible to patients was the choice. 6 minutes with a trusted family doctor who would send them home with something that worked, or a 50-minute appointment with a stranger who would ask them to talk about their childhood in a building they'd have to drive to on the other side of town. The math in 1963 was not complicated. The GP won the turf war by not fighting it. He simply continued to be present, available, trusted, and willing, and the patients continued to come to him, and the prescriptions continued to be written, and the psychiatrist on the second floor saw his 40 patients a year and published occasionally in journals and was consulted rarely and never quite loudly enough. The small print in the 1960s was very small, not merely in the typographical sense, though it was certainly that, but in the cultural sense of things that were technically known but practically unspoken. Doctors knew that benzodiazepines could cause dependence. The pharmaceutical companies knew this. The researchers who ran the trials knew this. What happened is not that the information did not exist. What happened is that the information was kept in a place where it did not interfere with the sales figures, the prescription rates, or the pleasant fiction that these medications were simply helping people cope with the ordinary pressures of modern life. You've been on the medication for 14 months when you first notice something that you will not yet have the vocabulary to describe accurately. You notice it on a Sunday when you open the cabinet and discover you are out of pills and the pharmacy is closed and your doctor's office is closed, and you have, without particularly planning to, allowed the refill to lapse by 3 days. By Sunday afternoon you are aware of something that feels at first like anxiety, your original complaint, back to visit you, apparently undeterred by 14 months of treatment, except that this anxiety has a different quality. It is physical in a way your original anxiety was not. Your heart is doing something unusual. Your hands are trembling slightly, the kind of trembling that isn't visible, but that you can feel when you reach for a glass of water. You're sleeping badly, which is where you started, but the sleeplessness now has an edge to it, a wired and jangling quality, unlike the flat sleeplessness that sent you to the doctor in the first place. By Monday morning, you're at the pharmacy before it opens. What you're experiencing is benzodiazepine withdrawal. You do not know this. Your doctor, who refills the prescription on Monday with his customary efficiency, does not tell you this. The information is available in the medical literature, has been available since the 1950s, when researchers noted that patients on meprobamate reported increased anxiety if they missed doses, and that increasing anxiety was the original reason for the prescription, and that this created a cycle whose logical conclusion was uncomfortable to examine. The researchers examined it. The papers were published. The detailed men continued to call. The side effects that were mentioned, drowsiness, dizziness, impaired coordination, were the ones that appeared in the first days of taking the medication, the ones that resolved as the body adjusted, the ones that were inconvenient rather than dangerous. The side effects that were not routinely mentioned were the ones that appeared after months or years of use, the dependence, the tolerance that required escalating doses for the same effect, the withdrawal syndrome that could, in cases of long-term high-dose use, include seizures serious enough to require hospitalization. This is not the same as saying the drugs were bad. In the short term, for acute anxiety in specific clinical situations, benzodiazepines were and remain genuinely useful medications. The problem was not the medication. The problem was the duration. The problem was prescribing a medication intended for weeks to patients who would take it for years, without telling those patients what years of use would mean for their nervous systems, without a plan for discontinuation, without a framework for what happened when the course of treatment had no course. The small print stayed small. The prescriptions kept being written, the cabinet got refilled, and somewhere in the suburb on a Sunday afternoon, a woman reached for her bottle and found it empty, and felt the world sharpen around her in a way she did not understand and would not understand for years, and called the pharmacy first thing Monday morning, because clearly she still needed this. Clearly the original problem was still there. Clearly the medication was working. By the time a patient realized she was dependent on her prescription, and the realization, when it came, usually came at the moment the bottle was empty, and the world suddenly felt like a terrifying high-pitched version of itself. She had often been taking the medication for years. The doctor had been refilling it automatically, the way he refilled her husband's blood pressure medication, with a cheerful efficiency that suggested this was simply a maintenance situation. Nobody had told her there would come a day when stopping would feel like the ground had been removed from under her. Nobody had quite framed it as something that would be difficult to undo. The word dependent is clinical and clean, and does not convey the texture of the experience, which is less like a moral failing, which is what the word will come to imply in later decades, and more like discovering, quite suddenly, that a wall you thought was decorative was actually load-bearing. The medication had been doing a structural job. You had not known it was doing a structural job. You had believed it was simply helping, the way aspirin helps a headache, intermittently and without consequence. You discover otherwise on a Tuesday in March when you're 3 days past your refill date, and the aspirin analogy collapses entirely. Your body, over the years of daily dosing, has reorganized itself around the presence of the medication. The GABA receptors that Valium enhances have down-regulated, the brain's way of compensating for the artificial calm by reducing its own sensitivity to calming signals. This is not negligence on the brain's part. It is adaptive. It is the nervous system doing what nervous systems do, which is adjust to the environment they are repeatedly placed in. The environment you have been repeatedly placing yours in, every morning for 4 years, is one of pharmaceutical calm. Remove the pharmaceutical calm and the nervous system, now calibrated for it, finds the ordinary world catastrophically loud. This is not what the doctor told you would happen. This is, in fairness, partly because the doctor didn't know in the specific terms described above the receptor downregulation research was still accumulating, and partly because knowing and telling are different actions, and telling required a conversation that the 6-minute appointment did not have room for, and also required a certain willingness to look directly at what the prescribing pattern had produced, which was uncomfortable, and which medicine in 1967 was not, yet culturally prepared to do directly. What you experience on the inside is this. The world without the medication is not the same world you lived in before the medication. It is louder, faster, more threatening, more exhausting, more everything. Your original anxiety, which was real and which the medication genuinely helped, now arrives amplified, wearing the borrowed intensity of 4 years of neurological adaptation. You cannot sleep. You cannot sit still. The mild social anxiety you originally presented with has become, in the absence of the medication, something that feels clinical and total. You go to the doctor. You tell him the medication isn't working anymore, or that something is wrong, or that you've been feeling much worse, or some combination of all three. He nods. He's familiar with this presentation. He has 2 tools available. He can increase the dose, or he can switch you to something newer. He increases the dose because that is the faster solution and the appointment is 6 minutes, and he has a waiting room. You leave with a new prescription. You fill it. The world quiets again. You feel briefly relief so intense it is almost joy. You make a note to never run out again. You do not make a note about what this means, because you do not yet have a framework for what this means. And the framework, when it finally arrives in the literature and then in the newspapers and then in the waiting room conversations, is still almost a decade away. Social life in the tranquilizer-era suburb had a quality that is hard to describe without sounding unkind, but which contemporary accounts mention with remarkable consistency. A particular smoothness, a collective lack of edges, a feeling at neighbourhood gatherings and dinner parties, and PTA meetings that everyone was present and correct, and moving slightly slower than the world seemed to require. People laughed at the right moments. Nobody argued too intensely. The evenings ended pleasantly. Whether this was the medication, the cocktails combined with the medication, or simply the social pressure of 1960s suburban propriety, is a question that several memoirs have since attempted to answer, with mixed results. You're at a dinner party. It is a Saturday evening in 1965, and there are 8 of you around a table in a house 3 streets over from yours, and the table is set very nicely with the good china and the silver that comes out only for occasions. And somebody's husband is telling a story about something that happened at the office that is, by objective measure, a moderately amusing story, and everyone is laughing with a warmth and unanimity that suggests either genuine community feeling or a shared neurological adjustment in the direction of warmth, possibly both. The cocktail hour had been generous. The cocktail hour in the 1960s suburban dinner party was always generous, because alcohol was the era's other great social lubricant, the legal, culturally sanctioned, actively encouraged partner to the pharmaceutical one. The 2 in combination, a Valium at 5, a martini at 6, a glass of wine with dinner, produced an effect that contemporary pharmacology would describe as dangerous synergistic central nervous system depression, and that the 1960s dinner party described as a lovely evening. Nobody fell down. That is important to understand. These were not falling down people. These were functional, competent, well-dressed adults who maintained their houses and their careers and their marriages with evident skill. The medication had not made them dysfunctional. It had made them smooth. The rough edges that might, in a fully unmedicated state, have produced a genuine disagreement about school redistricting or a real conversation about whether someone's marriage was visibly under strain, those edges were filed down just enough to prevent the conversation from arriving. Everyone was pleasant. Everyone stayed pleasant. The evening ended pleasantly. The dishes were done. There is a woman at this table, you have known her for 6 years, since the Hendersons moved in across the street, whose husband has been having an affair that you and 2 other people at this table know about, and that she almost certainly suspects. She's seated across from him right now, laughing at the office story. Her face is composed in the particular way that faces compose themselves when the composition is being assisted. She will not say anything tonight. She will not say anything for another 2 years. This is not purely pharmaceutical. Silence about these things was the social norm regardless of medication, but the medication makes the silence easier to maintain, which means it stays maintained longer than it might otherwise. This is the part of the story that the pharmaceutical companies did not put in the ads, that managing distress and resolving distress are different things. A medication manages without resolving, and the unresolved thing continues to exist beneath the managed surface. And eventually, when the management stops or becomes insufficient, the thing that was there all along is still there, having accumulated whatever it accumulates during years of polite suppression. The dinner party ends at 11. You drive home 3 streets, which in retrospect was not ideal given the martinis and the pill at 5, but which in 1965 nobody describes as drunk driving, because you were not drunk. You were having a lovely evening. You park the car. You go inside. You do not remember the next morning what the office story was about, but you remember it was funny. You take your pill. The day begins smoothly. This is the life. It is going very well. Every suburb had one. He was popular in a way that, in retrospect, explains itself. He did not tell you things you didn't want to hear. He did not ask you to make changes you were not prepared to make, and he reliably ended appointments with a solution in a bottle. His waiting room was always full. His patients recommended him to each other with warmth. He was not a bad man. That is perhaps the most important and most uncomfortable thing to say about him. He was a product of a system that has told him, through its journals and its conferences and its pharmaceutical representatives, that this was how you helped people. His name is Dr. Hargrove, and he's been practicing in this suburb since 1954, and his patient list is so long that he has a 6-week wait for new appointments and a 15-minute window for established patients, which in practice runs closer to 8. He is 61 years old. He went to medical school in the 40s, did his internship during the Korean War, and has been in practice here long enough that he has delivered some of his current patients and is now treating those patients' children. He has presence, the kind that comes not from authority, but from genuine accumulated trust. His patients believe he knows them. He does know them in the way that a doctor who has seen a family for 15 years knows them. Medically, contextually, across the full range of their ordinary catastrophes. Dr. Hargrove prescribes tranquilizers the way he prescribes blood pressure medication and antibiotics and vitamin supplements, as a tool deployed when the symptom is present and the tool is appropriate. He does not, in his own understanding, prescribe carelessly. He prescribes generously, which in his framework means responsively. When the patient presents a need, he meets it. When Mrs. Patterson comes in saying she hasn't been sleeping, he writes the prescription because he knows Mrs. Patterson, and he knows her household, and he knows that what Mrs. Patterson needs right now is a good night's sleep, not a referral to a specialist she won't see and a conversation she won't have. He is being practical. He is being kind. He has never made a patient worse in any way he can directly observe. This is not nothing. In the short term, in the specific appointment-by-appointment accounting that constitutes his practice, his prescribing works, the patients sleep, the patients feel better, the patients come back and say thank you and bring him fruitcake at Christmas. He has never had a patient die from the medication. He has had patients develop dependence that he interprets, charitably and perhaps correctly, as the original condition reasserting itself, evidence that the treatment is still necessary, not that the treatment has created a new problem. He does not read this as failure. He reads it as chronic disease management, which is, in his understanding, a legitimate category of medicine. What Dr. Hargrove cannot see from inside his practice is the aggregate. He cannot see that his prescribing rate is 3 times the regional average. He cannot see that 14% of his patient panel has been on benzodiazepines for more than 2 years. He cannot see the pharmacist's records, the refill frequency, the dose escalations over time. He cannot see Mrs. Patterson's Sunday afternoon with the empty bottle, because Mrs. Patterson did not call him on Sunday and did not describe it as a medical event on Monday. He can only see what arrives in the appointment, and what arrives in the appointment is managed, composed pharmaceutical. His patients look fine. They are fine. They keep telling him they are fine. He will retire in 1973. His patients will be transferred to a younger colleague who will look at some of the files and ask certain questions that were not previously asked. The younger colleague will have a difficult few years. He will be less popular than Dr. Hargrove. Some patients will leave the practice to find someone more like Dr. Hargrove, and they will find someone more like Dr. Hargrove, because Dr. Hargrove was not unusual. He was the norm. He was, by every measure that the system provided for measuring such things, an excellent doctor. In the fruitcake reckoning, which is its own kind of evidence, he may well have been right. They did talk about it eventually, though not in the way the 1980s and 90s would later talk about it, not with the language of addiction or medical malpractice or systemic failure. They talked about it the way women in the 1960s talked about most things, obliquely with humour, in the kitchen after the men had gone to the living room. They called it my prescription, or what my doctor gave me for my nerves, or sometimes with a rueful laugh, simply the little pill. There was no stigma in the sense we mean it now. There was instead a kind of weary, communal understanding that some things about modern life required assistance, and that the assistance was available, and that they were probably all taking it. The kitchen, at the end of the dinner party, has a different quality than the dining room. The dining room is where the evening performs itself. The good china, the office story, the managed laughter. The kitchen is where the evening reveals itself, when the women bring the dishes in, and the men settle into the living room with their drinks, and the door between the 2 rooms stands slightly ajar, and the conversation changes key. The kitchen is where the real information travels. You're standing at the sink with Carol, rinsing plates, and she says something that begins as a joke. She asks if you brought your prescription because she left hers at home, and you laugh and she laughs, and then you both pause for half a second in the way that jokes sometimes pause when they're carrying more than jokes usually carry. You say yes, actually. She says her doctor switched her to something new. You say yours did too in the spring. You hand her a plate. She dries it. The conversation moves on. This is how it was discussed. Not examined, not interrogated, discussed. The pill was a shared reference point, a piece of common vocabulary that required no explanation in this kitchen, in this suburb, among these women who have been navigating the same arrangement since roughly the same year. It was information exchanged rather than confessed. You were on it too was a statement of community rather than vulnerability, a way of saying we're in the same situation and we manage it the same way, and that is ordinary. That is just how this works. What the kitchen conversation did not include, could not easily include in 1965, was the question underneath the fact. Not just that they were all taking it, but why? Why did a neighbourhood of healthy, housed, fed, not visibly suffering women require pharmaceutical intervention to get through the week? That question required a framework that Betty Friedan had just begun to provide and that the suburb had not yet fully metabolised. It required a willingness to look at the structure rather than just the symptom, and looking at the structure meant considering the possibility that the structure was the problem, which meant considering changes to the structure, which was a much bigger and more frightening conversation than the one about the prescription. So they talked about the pill, they shared doctors' names, compared medications, noted that one was gentler than another. They talked about it with the slightly dark humour of people who have found a manageable way through a situation they cannot yet name. The humour was real. The community was real. The obliqueness was protective and, in its own way, functional. Years later, some of these women will write about this era in memoirs that use the language of later decades, addiction, dependency, systemic failure, and look back at the kitchen conversations with a mixture of affection and sorrow, affection for the humour and the solidarity, sorrow for everything the humour was standing in front of. The kitchen was warm, the plates were clean. The conversation was what the conversation could be, given the year, given the suburb, given the life. It was enough until it wasn't. The children who grew up in those sedated suburbs did not necessarily understand what they were observing. They understood, in the way children understand things they are not told directly, that the small brown bottle on the bathroom shelf was something significant, that certain hours of the afternoon were quiet hours, that their mothers moved through domestic life with a particular kind of muted steadiness. Some of those children became adults who asked questions. Some of them wrote books. Some of them simply recognized years later a pattern in their own relationships with pharmaceutical calm that made a great deal more sense once they knew the history. You're 8 years old, and the bathroom cabinet is at your eye level when you stand on the step stool to brush your teeth, and the brown bottle is the third thing on the second shelf, between the aspirin and the cold medicine. You cannot read the label yet with any fluency, but you know the bottle. You know which days your mother opens it, which is most days, and you know the sound it makes, the small plastic snap of the lid, the rattle of the pills, the running water. You know that after the sound there is a version of your mother who moves through the afternoon at a particular pace. Not slow exactly, steady, like a clock that has been recently wound. You do not find this alarming. Children do not find the architecture of their household alarming unless it gives them specific reason to, and this architecture gives you no specific reason. Your mother is present, she makes dinner, she attends your school events, she asks about your day with what appears to be genuine interest, and responds to your answers with appropriate warmth. Whatever the bottle is doing, it is not producing a mother who is absent or frightening or unpredictable. It is producing a mother who is steady. At 8 years old, steady is what you want in a mother. You do not think to ask what the steadiness costs. The cost will become legible to you in pieces, over years, beginning perhaps when you're 19 and in your first semester at college, and you call home on a difficult Tuesday, and your mother's voice has the quality you have always associated with the afternoon, and you ask if she is all right, and she says of course, and you recognize, for the first time with the cognitive tools of a young adult rather than the sensory acceptance of a child, that the answer is more complicated than the word. You ask your aunt about it at Thanksgiving the following year, your aunt who is 4 years older than your mother and grew up in a different decade and a different geography and has a different relationship with pharmaceutical management, tells you what she knows, the doctor, the prescription, how long, which medication, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a chronic condition, which is how the family has always understood it. Your mother had her nerves. The doctor gave her something for her nerves. This is what happened. This is what has continued to happen. This is what it is. What you carry forward from this in ways you will spend years sorting out is a particular relationship with the idea of managing versus resolving. You have watched, for your entire childhood, a masterclass in management. The household ran. The social obligations were met. The calendar was maintained. Nothing fell apart. And yet the thing that produced the steadiness was never examined, never named, never questioned in your presence. The management was so effective that it foreclosed the conversation, that might have made the management unnecessary. Some of the daughters of the tranquilizer era became the generation that built therapy culture, who insisted on talking about it, on naming it, on the long and sometimes exhausting work of resolution rather than management, who overcorrected possibly in the direction of examination, who raised their own children in households where the bottle on the shelf was discussed rather than simply present. The mothers handed down a silence, the daughters handed back a question. Neither generation has entirely forgiven the other for it, and both are right. It would be too simple to say that the 1960s counterculture was a direct reaction to suburban tranquilization. There were other things going on, but it is not entirely wrong either. The young people who drove out of the suburbs in 1967 and arrived at places like Haight-Ashbury were, among other things, rejecting the medicated smoothness of the world they had grown up in. They wanted, with an intensity that was itself somewhat alarming, to feel things, unfiltered, unmanaged, chemically unassisted things. That the substances many of them chose in order to feel things more intensely were also chemicals is one of the era's more persistent ironies, but irony was never the counterculture's strong suit. You're 22 years old, and you've grown up in a house where the television was on after dinner, and the lawn was mowed on Saturdays, and nobody raised their voice above a certain register, and the overall quality of domestic life was one of maintained, enforced, pharmaceutical tranquility that you could not have named at 12, but that you can name now, standing in a park in San Francisco with your shoes off, and the name you have for it is death. This is an overstatement. You're 22, and 22 is the age at which overstatement feels like precision. What you're rejecting is real, even if the rejection is theatrically extreme. You grew up watching adults perform contentment so consistently that the performance became indistinguishable from the content, and the distinction only revealed itself in the gaps. The Sunday afternoon your mother couldn't find her bottle, the dinner party where the laughter had the quality of something slightly hollow, the particular way your father drove home from work every day with the expression of someone who had decided not to feel something, and had been deciding that for 15 years. You noticed all of it. Children notice everything they are not told. The counterculture's critique of suburban pharmaceutical culture was real, and it was pointed, and it appeared in the music before it appeared anywhere else, which is where the important critiques usually appear first. The Rolling Stones noticed in '66. The Beatles noticed the same year. Johnny Mitchell would notice throughout the following decade with more precision and more sorrow. The song said, "Look at what is happening in those houses. Look at what it costs. Look at the distance between the clean lawn and the life being lived behind it." The songs were right. And then the counterculture reached for its own chemicals, which is where the critique became complicated. LSD was not Valium. It did not produce smoothness. It produced the opposite of smoothness. It produced an experience of reality so unmanaged and unfiltered that it frequently produced terror alongside the revelation. The counterculture's argument was that this was better, that raw and terrifying was more honest than smooth and functional, that breaking down the management was worth the cost of the breakdown. This argument was not entirely wrong. It was also not the solution it presented itself as. By 1970, the hate was producing its own pharmaceutical casualties, its own population of people whose relationship with chemical reality had become complicated in ways that rhymed uncomfortably with the brown bottles on the bathroom shelves back home. The specific chemicals were different. The dynamic, a population using substances to manage an experience of the world that felt unmanageable without them, was recognizable. The suburb and the commune were, in this one specific way, more similar than either wanted to admit. Both had decided that ordinary consciousness was insufficient. Both had reached for a solution. The solutions pointed in opposite directions and arrived at the same question. What is it about this world that so many people cannot bear to feel without assistance? That question outlasted the counterculture, as the good questions always do. Pharmaceutical advertising in the 1960s was not directed at patients. Direct-to-consumer drug advertising would not become legal for decades. But it was aimed with extraordinary precision at the people who stood between the manufacturer and the patient, doctors. And the message those ads delivered in the glossy pages of JAMA and The Lancet and half a dozen other journals was less about clinical efficacy than about emotional ease. The message was, your patients are suffering from the pressures of modern life, and we have something that helps. And isn't that what medicine is for? It was a question with an obvious answer, and the answer was yes, and the yes moved a great deal of product. The craft of pharmaceutical advertising in this era deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it was genuinely sophisticated work that understood its audience with the precision of people who had studied that audience carefully, which they had. The doctors reading these journals were intelligent, educated, professionally skeptical people. You did not sell them with simple appeals. You sold them with something that looked and felt like clinical information but carried, beneath the data and the dosage charts, a carefully constructed emotional argument. The emotional argument worked like this. First, acknowledge the patient's suffering in terms that make the doctor feel seen. You understand these patients, the ad says, without saying it. You see them every week. You know how they struggle. This is true, and the recognition of its truth creates a moment of professional solidarity between the advertisement and the reader. The ad is not trying to fool you. The ad understands your work. Second, name the suffering in medical language, which transforms it from a social condition into a clinical one. Anxiety disorder, situational stress response, psychoneurotic manifestation. The language is not wrong. These are real diagnostic categories, but the application is broad enough to encompass most of the human population on most days, which is not an accident. The broader the category, the larger the market. Third, present the product as the natural conclusion of the diagnostic logic you have just established. The patient has a condition. The condition has a treatment. The treatment is this medication. The sequence is so clean, so internally consistent, that refusing it would require you to question the premise rather than the conclusion, which is a harder move to make inside a 6-minute appointment when the patient is sitting across from you and the prescription pad is right there. One 1967 ad for a Valium competitor showed a woman's hands, middle-aged wedding ring, reaching toward the camera in a gesture that could be interpreted as a plea or as an offering, or simply as reaching. The headline read, "She's asking for help." The body copy assured the doctor that this help was available, that the clinical evidence was solid, that the side effect profile was benign. What the body copy did not address was the question of what, specifically, she was asking for help with, and whether the help being offered was the help being asked for. That gap between the help that was being asked for and the help that was being provided is where the entire era lived. The ads did not create the gap. The social structure created the gap. The ads identified it, named it in clinical language, and pointed to a product as the solution. That is what advertising does. It finds the space between what people have and what they want, and it places a product in that space, and it does so with such grace and such genuine attentiveness to the real texture of the want that the placement feels, at the moment of placement, entirely natural. The ads worked. They worked for years. They worked so well that by the time anyone thought to examine them as a cultural artifact rather than a clinical resource, they had already done most of their work. The journals are archived. The ads are still in them. If you look at them now, they're almost unbearably legible. The woman's hands, the doctor's pad, the product name in confident type at the bottom of the page, promising to close the distance between the life people were living and the life they were supposed to be living, one prescription at a time. Eventually, in some suburbs, a new doctor arrived. He had trained in the late 1960s rather than the 40s or 50s, which meant he had been a medical student at precisely the moment when the questions about benzodiazepine dependence were beginning to accumulate in the literature. He asked his patients different questions. He was slower to reach for the pad. His waiting room was somewhat less full, initially, because his appointments took longer, and he sometimes said things patients had not come to hear. He was not, in the short term, as popular as the doctor he had replaced. In the long term, he was considerably better at medicine. His name is Dr. Callahan, and he is 34 years old, and he has just taken over the practice from Dr. Hargrove, who retired in January, and it is now April, and the adjustment is not going smoothly. He drives a smaller car than Dr. Hargrove drove. He does not make house calls, which 3 patients have already mentioned to him, in a tone that suggests this is a significant professional failing. His appointments run 12 minutes, sometimes 15, because he asks follow-up questions, which Dr. Hargrove apparently did not do with any regularity, and the follow-up questions take time. The first time a patient comes in for a Valium refill, he does not automatically reach for the pad. He looks at the chart, Dr. Hargrove's handwriting, meticulous and brisk, and he asks how long. The patient says 4 years. He asks what the original presenting complaint was. She says nerves. He says, "Can you tell me more about that?" This is the question. This is the question that takes time. She looks at him with the slightly wary expression of someone who ordered a sandwich and has been handed a menu. She tells him more about that. It takes 11 minutes. At the end of the 11 minutes, he has more information about her life than Dr. Hargrove collected in 4 years, and some of it is medically relevant in ways that the prescription had been managing without addressing. He refills the prescription. He is not reckless. An abrupt discontinuation after 4 years is medically inadvisable. But he also makes a referral, which Dr. Hargrove apparently did not make either. He schedules a follow-up in 6 weeks. He notes the plan to begin a slow taper when the patient is ready. She is not sure she is ready. She tells her friend Carol about the new doctor, and Carol says he sounds like a lot of work, which is accurate. He is a lot of work. He requires more of his patients than a 6-minute appointment requires. More disclosure, more participation, more willingness to sit in the space between the symptom and the prescription and examine what is in that space. Some patients find this valuable. Some patients find it inconvenient and leave the practice for a doctor in the next town who still practices more like Dr. Hargrove, because Dr. Hargrove was available and warm and never made you think too hard about a Wednesday afternoon. But some stay, and the ones who stay, slowly, begin to have different conversations in the kitchen after the dinner party. Not better conversations necessarily, not cleaner or more resolved, but more honest ones. Conversations that use words with more precision, that are less oblique, that are willing to stay in the difficult territory a little longer before retreating to humour. The language is changing. The framework is arriving. It is arriving late, and it is arriving unevenly, and it is carried into the suburb not by a social movement or a regulatory shift, but by a 34-year-old doctor with a small car who asks follow-up questions and schedules 6-week check-ins and is slowly getting busier. She was 41, and she had been taking her prescription for 6 years, and one afternoon she looked at the bottle and realized she did not know what was in it. She knew the brand name. She knew the color of the pill. She did not know the mechanism of action, the duration of safe use, the process for stopping, or the reason the doctor had started her on it in the first place, beyond the general understanding that she had been having a hard time, and this was what you did when you were having a hard time. She made a note to ask at her next appointment. At her next appointment, she forgot to ask. This was not, in the 1960s, unusual. Her name is irrelevant in the sense that her name could be any of several 100,000 names. She is the person in the suburb who, at some point between the prescribing and the present, paused and noticed the gap between what she knew about her medication and what she knew about, say, the brand of dishwasher detergent she used, about which she had opinions. She knew the detergent's active ingredients. She knew why she preferred it over the alternative. She could, if asked, explain the rationale for the choice. The pills she had been taking every morning for 6 years she could not explain in equivalent terms. This is partly her fault, in the sense that she had not asked. It is also not her fault, in the sense that the system she was operating in had not invited asking. The information sheet that came with the prescription, when there was one, which was not always, described the most common side effects in language calibrated to reassure rather than inform. The doctor who prescribed it had explained what it would do in the short term and had not, in any conversation she could recall, discussed what 6 years of daily dosing would mean neurologically, because that conversation would have required an honesty about the nature of the prescription that the culture of the practice did not yet support. She writes the note. She puts it on the kitchen counter where she keeps things she means to remember. She sees it every morning when she takes the pill. The appointment is in 3 weeks. She goes to the appointment. The appointment is about her knee, which has been bothering her, and there is an X-ray and a discussion of the X-ray. And somewhere in the middle of the discussion about the knee, she thinks of the note and the question, and she opens her mouth to ask it, and then the knee discussion concludes and the doctor stands up, which is the signal that the appointment is concluding, and she says thank you and puts her coat on and leaves. She asks the question 3 appointments later, in the fall, when the appointment is slower and there is more time, and she has written the question on a piece of paper that she holds in her hand. The doctor's answer is informative, partial, and delivered in a tone that is professionally reassuring in a way that is slightly different from genuinely reassuring. He tells her what the medication does. He tells her it is well tolerated. He doesn't tell her the word dependence, but he says something in the neighbourhood of it. Something about how the body adjusts, how stopping should be done gradually, how it is best not to discontinue abruptly. She hears this as a warning. She's right to hear it as a warning. She goes home. She looks at the bottle. She knows slightly more than she knew before, which is both better and, in the way that partial information is sometimes worse than no information, more unsettling. She knows there is a there, something in the relationship between her body and the pill that is more structural than she understood. She does not yet know what to do with this knowledge. She puts the bottle back on the shelf. She will ask again. Not this year, but she will ask again, and the next time she asks the question will have sharper edges, because she will have read something, an article, a friend's account, eventually a newspaper story that gives her a language for what she is asking. The language, when it arrives, will be both a relief and a reckoning. For now, she caps the bottle, straightens the shelf, and goes to start dinner. She's a person who has asked a question. That is further than most people got in 1967, and it counts for something. There were wards in hospitals across the country that appeared in patient charts under administrative language too neutral to convey what was actually happening in them. These were the places where women, and it was predominantly women, though not exclusively, arrived after years on tranquilizers and found themselves unable to manage the discontinuation at home. The symptoms of benzodiazepine withdrawal, when the medication had been taken for years at therapeutic doses, included anxiety, insomnia, tremors, and occasionally seizures. The medicine given to manage these symptoms was often, in the early years of the problem, a lower dose of the same class of drug. Medicine, when it creates a problem, tends to reach for itself as the solution. The ward is on the 3rd floor of a general hospital in a mid-sized American city, and it has a name on the chart that says something like Nervous Disorders Unit or neurological rest ward, and it has 12 beds and a television mounted to the wall and windows that look out on the hospital parking lot, and it smells like institution smell everywhere, which is to say clean in a way that is trying to cover something that is not clean. The women on the ward are not by any outward measure sick in the way hospital patients are usually sick. They are not bleeding. They are not post-surgical. They're sitting up in their beds, or walking the corridor, or staring at the television with the specific concentration of someone who is using the television as a substitute for thinking. What they are is in withdrawal, though this word appears in their charts with less frequency than its prevalence warrants, filed under euphemisms that maintain the fiction that what is happening is a relapse of the original condition rather than a consequence of the treatment. The distinction matters enormously, medically and legally, and the chart language reflects a preference for the interpretation that generates less liability. You arrived on Tuesday. Your doctor sent you, after the third day without medication, produced symptoms that your husband, alarmed, described as a nervous crisis, which sent you to the emergency room, which sent you upstairs. You're not in crisis now in the dramatic sense. You're in the sustained, grinding, physical distress of a nervous system recalibrating under protest. The anxiety is enormous and indiscriminate, not about anything, about everything, about the air. The insomnia is absolute. You have not slept in 3 days in any way that constitutes sleep. Your hands shake in a way that you hide by keeping them in your lap. The resident who checks on you is 28 and recently trained and slightly uncertain in the way that residents are uncertain when they are managing a condition that their training addressed partially and in passing. He gives you a lower dose of chlordiazepoxide, which is Librium, to manage the withdrawal from diazepam, which is Valium, because this is the protocol, and the protocol makes a certain sense in the short term, and in the short term is the frame in which most hospital medicine operates. He schedules a slow taper. He is doing his best with the tools available. What the ward does not have, what the hospital does not have, what the medical system in 1968 largely does not have, is a coherent framework for what comes after the taper. There is no outpatient support program. There is no group therapy for benzodiazepine dependence, because that diagnosis does not exist in the terms being used, and you cannot build a support program around a diagnosis that has not been named. There is the ward, and then there is discharge, and then there is home, and home contains the life that sent you to the doctor in the first place, and the doctor who sent you to the doctor is still there, with his prescription pad, genuinely wanting to help, reaching for the most reliable tool he has. Some women cycle through the ward more than once. This is noted in the charts. The notes do not, in 1968, produce a systemic response. They produce individual notes, in individual charts, filed in individual hospitals, waiting for someone to look at them collectively and ask the question that the aggregate demands. That person is coming. They're in medical school right now, or working a residency, or sitting in a library reading the papers that are beginning to accumulate. They will ask the question in about a decade. The ward continues in the meantime. The Food and Drug Administration in the 1960s was not the institution it would eventually become. It was understaffed, underfunded, and operating under a regulatory framework that had not been designed for the volume and velocity of pharmaceutical innovation coming out of the post-war research labs. It approved drugs. It reviewed adverse event reports when they were filed. It did not in any systematic way monitor what happened to the population of patients taking those drugs over years. The question of long-term population-level effects was simply not a question the regulatory system had been built to ask. The FDA's offices are in Washington, and the people working in them are not villains. They are bureaucrats in the original and neutral sense, people doing the work of administration within a structure built by legislation that preceded them, and which they are not individually empowered to redesign. The legislation says, approve drugs that are shown to be safe and effective. The FDA does this. The clinical trials that demonstrate safety and efficacy run for weeks or months. They are well designed within their parameters. They show that benzodiazepines work, which is true. They show that the side effects in the short term are manageable, which is also true. They do not show what happens after 4 years because the trials do not run for 4 years. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural gap, the natural consequence of a regulatory framework built to evaluate products rather than practices, to approve a medication rather than to monitor what medicine does with the medication once it has been approved. The FDA says this drug is safe and effective at this dose for this duration. The medical system hears this drug is safe and effective. The duration becomes implicit, then forgotten, then irrelevant, because by the time anyone is thinking about duration, the prescription has been running for 2 years and the patient is dependent, and the question of duration is no longer theoretical. There were people within the system who noticed. Adverse event reports came in. Individual physicians filing paperwork about patients who had developed dependence, patients who had experienced severe withdrawal, patients whose course of treatment had produced outcomes inconsistent with the short-term safety profile. The reports were reviewed. The reports were filed. The volume of reports was not yet high enough in the mid-1960s to trigger the formal review process that would have escalated the concern. The threshold was not crossed. The threshold was being approached steadily as the prescription rate climbed. What the FDA also lacked in this era was any mechanism for communicating with patients directly. Pharmaceutical regulation spoke to manufacturers and physicians. The patient was downstream of both conversations, receiving information second-hand through the physician, which meant receiving information filtered through the physician's judgment about what the patient needed to know, which in most cases was less than the full picture. Direct patient communication, warning labels visible to the person taking the drug, black box warnings, mandatory information sheets would come later as a direct consequence of the failures of this period. The mechanisms that now exist to protect patients were built substantially from the wreckage of the era we are describing. The FDA will eventually act. There will be hearings in the mid-1970s and into the 80s at which the prescribing patterns of the previous 2 decades will be examined with the uncomfortable clarity of retrospect. There will be new labeling requirements, new prescribing guidelines, new limitations on duration. The response will be serious and somewhat late, and largely effective going forward. The suburb, meanwhile, has its prescription. The cabinet has its bottle. The morning has its pill. The regulatory gap between approval and accountability remains wide enough, in 1966, for a generation of patients to fall through it without anyone in Washington noticing. Because noticing required counting, and counting required data, and data required a system designed to collect it, and that system is still being built, slowly, by people in offices who are doing their best with the framework that exists. There is not a single moment when the tranquilizer era ended, because things like that do not end in single moments. But there is a year, 1979, when a British psychiatrist named Malcolm Lader published a study using brain scans to demonstrate structural changes in the brains of long-term benzodiazepine users, and the medical press covered it, and some of the coverage reached the general press, and some of the general press reached the people sitting in suburban kitchens with their brown bottles. The next time those patients went to refill their prescriptions, some of them asked a question their doctors had not been asked before. What happens if I stop? Malcolm Lader is not a household name, which is a measure of how the culture distributes credit for the things that matter. He's a pharmacologist and psychiatrist at the Institute of Psychiatry in London, and he's been studying benzodiazepine dependence since the early 1970s. when the clinical literature began accumulating with enough density to suggest that something systematic was happening to a specific population of long-term users. His 1979 study is not the first paper on the subject. It is the one that produces images, actual brain scan images, showing visible changes in brain structure in people who have been on the medication for years, and images do something to public discourse that papers cannot always do on their own. You can argue with a paper. It is harder to argue with a picture. The coverage in the British press is immediate and alarmed, in the way that British press coverage of pharmaceutical scandals tends to be immediate and alarmed. The coverage crosses the Atlantic more slowly, filtered through American medical caution and the considerable institutional reluctance of a medical culture that has been confidently prescribing these medications for 15 years and is not eager to revisit that confidence in public. The American medical press covers the Leder findings carefully, with the appropriate scientific qualifications, noting that the study is preliminary and that further research is needed and that patients should consult their physicians before making any changes to their medication. The patients consult their physicians. The physicians, many of whom have read the same coverage and are themselves in the early stages of a professional reckoning, give answers that are more careful than the answers they gave 5 years ago. Some of them begin, for the first time, to mention dependence by name. Some of them propose tapering schedules. Some of them do neither, because the appointment is still 8 minutes, and the waiting room is still full, and the reckoning, like most reckonings, arrives unevenly and at different speeds in different offices. In the kitchen of the house 3 streets over, Carol reads the newspaper article on a Thursday morning and reads it again. She's been on the medication for 9 years. She puts the article on the counter next to the coffee. She reads it a 3rd time. She calls her friend and reads her a paragraph over the phone, the paragraph about the brain scans, and there is a silence on the line that has a different quality from the comfortable kitchen silences of the previous decade. This silence has something in it that was not previously present. It is the sound of a framework arriving. She does not stop the medication on Thursday. She does not stop it that month. Stopping is not simple, and she knows at a physical level that precedes intellectual knowledge that it will not be simple. But something has shifted. The bottle on the shelf looks different than it did on Wednesday. It is the same bottle. The shift is in the looking. The music has not stopped. She will take the pill tomorrow morning and the morning after, but she can hear for the first time the particular silence underneath it, and the silence sounds like the beginning of a question. She's been not quite asking for 9 years, and now she is asking it, and the answer is going to take a while, but the question has been asked, and in the long history of how things change, the question is where everything starts. The legacy of the tranquilizer era is not only in the historical record, the medical journals, the lawsuits that followed in the 1980s, the congressional hearings, the memoirs and the documentaries. It is also in the medicine cabinets. It is in the pills that were prescribed in 1968 and refilled in 1969 and refilled again every 3 weeks for the next 12 years, and then gradually, painfully, under medical supervision, discontinued or not discontinued, because discontinuation was its own medical event. It is in the habits of mind that were formed during those years, the understanding, passed down through families, that discomfort was something to be managed rather than investigated. Open the cabinet. You know the one. Every family from this era has one, or had one, or has a memory of one, the cabinet in the house you grew up in, or the house your grandmother lived in, or the house your aunt never quite left. The cabinet where the brown bottles stood in their modest row, labelled with names that became familiar enough to lose their clinical quality and become simply part of the household vocabulary. The Valium, the Librium, whatever the current one was, unremarkable, domestic, as ordinary as the aspirin beside it, which is itself remarkable when you think about what the bottles contained. The legacy in the cabinet is partly the obvious one, the long tail of dependence that the prescribing era produced, the population of people who spent years or decades on medications they could not easily stop, whose nervous systems had reorganized around a daily pharmaceutical reality that could not be unwound without significant medical supervision and time. This is documented. The congressional hearings of the late 1970s and the legal actions of the 1980s produced a record. The record exists, it's not ambiguous. But the legacy in the cabinet is also subtler than the documented record. It is in the relationship with discomfort that the era normalized. The idea, absorbed at the level of family practice and then at the level of family life, that the appropriate response to internal distress is external management. That the body's signal of something wrong is not information to be examined but a symptom to be treated. That the distance between feeling bad and taking something for it should be short, should be shorter than sitting with it, shorter than talking about it, shorter than asking what it means. This is the inheritance that the daughters and granddaughters of the tranquilizer era carried forward, not necessarily in prescription form. The regulatory changes of the 1980s substantially altered benzodiazepine prescribing patterns, but in the cultural logic that shaped their relationship with their own inner lives. The cabinet was a daily lesson in a particular philosophy. Discomfort is a problem. Problems have solutions. Solutions come in bottles. The doctor provides the bottle. The lesson was not spoken. It did not need to be. It was enacted every morning at the sink. Some families broke the pattern consciously, with effort, through the therapy culture that rose in reaction to the pharmaceutical one. Some families replicated it with different substances. The cabinet changed its inventory but not its function. Some families held both tendencies simultaneously, therapy in one room and the bottle in the other, which is not hypocrisy but simply the human condition under pressure, doing what it can with what it has. The cabinet is mostly empty now, or holds different things. The benzodiazepine prescription rate declined substantially from its 1970s peak, though it has more recently been climbing again, which is its own story for another evening. The brown bottles are largely gone, but the logic they represented, that the distance between feeling and medicating should be minimal, that discomfort is primarily a medical event, that the body's report of something wrong is best handled quickly and pharmacologically, that logic is not gone. It is in the culture, in the medical system, in the habit of the hand that reaches for the cabinet before it reaches for the question. The era built something that outlasted its own prescriptions. That is the legacy. That is what remains. Here is the uncomfortable conclusion that the tranquilizer era eventually arrived at, several decades after it might have been useful. The suburbs of the 1960s were not suffering from a chemical imbalance. They were not suffering from a neurological disorder best treated with daily sedation. They were suffering from the ordinary anguish of people living lives that had been designed for them rather than by them, lives that were comfortable and secure and, in ways that were difficult to articulate in a 6-minute appointment, genuinely, persistently wrong. What they were asking for, when they sat down in the doctor's office and said they weren't sleeping or weren't coping or just couldn't seem to get through the afternoons, was not a pill. It was a question. The question they were asking was, is this all there is? The 1960s had a pill for that. It was not, as it turned out, the right answer, but it kept the waiting room full. You're sitting in the kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon in 1967, and the children are at school and the house is clean, and the casserole is assembled, and the afternoon stretches out ahead of you with the particular quality of an afternoon that has been successfully managed and now has nothing left to manage. There is a stillness in the house that you have learned over years to fill with tasks because the stillness without tasks has a quality that the tasks prevent. The tasks run out at 2:45. The children come home at 3:15. You have 30 minutes with the stillness, which is 30 minutes more than is comfortable. The question arrives in these 30 minutes. It is not a dramatic question. It does not arrive wearing existential clothing or demanding immediate philosophical attention. It arrives as a feeling, the feeling for 30 minutes twice a week that something is missing, that the shape of the life is precisely what was promised, and that the promise contained, somewhere in its fine print, a gap between the shape and the substance. The casserole is assembled, the children will be fed, the husband will come home and will be fed, and will watch the television, and will sleep, and will drive to work, and will return, and you will do this again. The same casserole or a different one, the same 30 minutes or a different afternoon, the same stillness with the same quality, reliably, indefinitely, until something changes or nothing changes and both options have the same texture in the imagination. This is the thing the pill treated. Not the question. The pill cannot treat a question, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it, but the feeling that the question produces, the particular hollow quality of the 2:45 stillness. The pill made the stillness quieter, more bearable, less insistent. It did not answer the question. It made the question easier to not ask. What the woman in the kitchen at 2:45 was actually asking for was possibility, the sense, however modest, that the shape of the life had some elasticity, that the casserole was not the ceiling. She was asking for the kind of conversation with her doctor that the appointment did not have time for, the kind of conversation with her husband that the marriage did not have language for, the kind of conversation with herself that the culture had not given her permission to have. She was asking for work that was hers. She was asking for intellectual space. She was asking, in the vocabulary available to 1967, for things that did not yet have names on the shelf above the washer. The pill answered a question that had not been asked, and in doing so it deferred the question that had been asked, which deferred the answer, which deferred the change that the answer might have produced, which meant that the suburb in 1975 looked remarkably like the suburb in 1962, except that the brown bottles were older, and the women were a decade further along in a life that was still the same shape, and the question was still there, still arriving on Wednesday afternoons at 2:45, still waiting for someone to sit down with it and stay. The answer was not in the cabinet. It was never in the cabinet. The cabinet was where the era put it because the cabinet was available, and the answer was not, and convenience, in medicine as in life, often wins. The suburb got a pill when it needed a conversation, a structure when it needed space, a treatment when it needed permission. This is what the era gave it. The era was wrong, and it was well-intentioned, and it was very confident, and it kept the waiting room full, and the waiting room was full because the people inside it were genuinely suffering, and they deserved something better than what they got. They got the pill. The question remained. The casserole got made. The 30 minutes passed, and somewhere in the cabinet the brown bottle stood patient and present and entirely ready, waiting to be helpful in the only way it knew how, which was not the way that was needed, but was the way that was there. And so, here you are, back in your clean bed, in your warm room, in a house with double-paned windows and a thermostat on the wall, and a medicine cabinet full of things you chose yourself, with labels you can read and a pharmacist who will answer your questions, and a doctor, if you're very lucky, and you are luckier than most people in history, who has more than 8 minutes and occasionally asks how you're doing, and means something more specific than the question usually carries. Think about what you just witnessed. An entire generation of people, mostly women, quietly suffering in well-maintained houses on streets with freshly paved curbs, who sat down in a doctor's office and asked in the only language available to them for something that the doctor didn't have in his bag. They asked for permission to feel what they were feeling. They asked for the question to be taken seriously. They asked, at 2:45 on a Wednesday afternoon, in 30 minutes of kitchen stillness, whether the shape of the life was the whole of the life. They got a pill, and they took it, because the pill helped, and because help was what they needed, and because no better help was on offer, and because human beings are remarkably good at accepting the available solution and calling it sufficient. That is not weakness. That is survival. That is people doing what people do, making the best of the architecture they were given, finding the grace in the constrained space, maintaining the casserole and the lawn and the social calendar and the marriage and the children with a steadiness that, even assisted, even pharmaceutical, was a genuine and exhausting achievement. The resilience of the tranquilizer era is not a comfortable resilience. It does not look like the resilience we prefer in our history, the heroic, the defiant, the visibly brave. It looks like a woman in a clean kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon, taking a small pill with a glass of water and going on. It looks like a whole neighbourhood doing the same thing, in the same kitchens, with the same glasses of water, independently and collectively and entirely without acknowledgement. It looks like endurance that asked for nothing because asking was not available, and performed contentment because performance was what the situation required, and kept going because keeping going was the only direction. They kept going. Most of them came out the other side. The bottles were eventually emptied, or replaced with something better, or discontinued in the slow, careful medical way that discontinuation required. The questions they could not ask in 1962 began to have language by 1972, and frameworks by 1982, and something approaching answers, imperfect, contested, still arriving in the decades that followed. The daughters asked the questions the mothers couldn't. The granddaughters built systems to hold the answers. The kitchen conversations got louder and more precise, and moved out of the kitchen and into the culture, where they changed things slowly and then faster, in the way that deferred questions eventually change things when they are finally allowed to be asked. So tonight, as you lie in your bed with your full information and your follow-up questions, and your appointment that runs 12 minutes, and your therapist if you have one, and your genuine if imperfect access to the question of what your life means, and whether the shape fits the substance, tonight, maybe hold a moment of something quiet for them. For the woman at 2:45, for the kitchen conversations, for the generation that carried the question in silence for years, and somehow kept the casseroles made, and the children fed and the lawn cut and the whole elaborate performance of a life running smoothly on a pill that helped with the symptom and left the question intact. They were not broken. They were constrained, and they endured the constraint with a dignity that the air did not bother to name, because naming it would have required acknowledging the cost, and acknowledging the cost would have required a conversation nobody in 1962 was quite ready to have. The conversation happened eventually. It is still happening. The 30 minutes pass, the children come home, the casserole gets made. Sleep now. You're safe. The question can wait until morning.